Welcome back to Shadows of the Past, where we shine our light on the shadows of history. Since it's been a hot minute since part 1 of the SLA story, I figured I'd do a quick recap. It all started in 1973, when a few UCLA Berkeley students met with prisoners in an outreach program, where they would discuss political and social issues. A splinter group would be formed with more radical ideas under one prisoner, Donald DeFreeze. A convict with a violent past, he would eventually escape and take up residence with friends of the UCLA students. These people would unite under the banner of the Symbionese Liberation Army, cementing an ethos calling for the overthrowing of the government through military might. They would enact their first major act of terrorism with the assassination of Marcus Foster, the first black superintendent for a major school system, and severely wounding his deputy. Two of the members, Russell Little and Joseph Ramiro, had just been caught by police with a myriad of incriminating evidence. The rest of the members of the SLA caught wind and tried to burn their hideout to the ground, but not thoroughly enough. And this is where we left off. And where we're going is in the high-profile kidnapping of a media magnate's daughter, and the eventual complicity in multiple robberies, the fiery standoff with the LAPD, and the form of justice the court found most appropriate. But with multiple members of the SLA having ties to the government, were there bigger, darker forces coming into play? One that could have withered everything it touched in the greater San Francisco and Los Angeles areas. And we'll also touch on this government spook who somehow became involved in this case. Let's find out and delve into the shadows.
Tape recording which purports to be an interview or a statement which includes somebody from the SLA and also the voice of Patricia Hearst.
I renounce my class privilege, and I would never choose to live the rest of my life surrounded by pigs like the Hearsts. Patria o muerte, venceremos. Death to the fascist insect that preys upon the life of the people.
On the eve of February 4th, 1974, Patricia Hearst was resting at home with her fiancé, Stephen Weed, after a long day at the UCLA campus when a sudden knock came to the door. Stephen answered, where he was met with a young, helpless-looking woman. It was one of the SLA members pretending to be a stranded damsel in distress, and as soon as she dropped the act, two armed men soon appeared and burst their way through the door. Stephen was struck with a bottle and beaten. Patricia, a 19-year-old girl just chilling at home in her blue robe, was then dragged kicking and screaming into the streets. She would be stuffed into the back of a white car where it would depart shortly with another SLA vehicle following close behind. Their address had been printed 3 months earlier in the San Francisco Chronicle about their engagement, leading her kidnappers to an easy victim. During this time, Patricia was kept mostly blindfolded and moved between multiple safe houses. She testified in court that she was kept in small closets where her hands were bound, isolated from everyone but her captors. They were there to either abuse her mentally or physically, reinforcing their rhetoric and Patricia's need to stay, only allowing her out at dinner for eating and political discussion. A flashlight and SLA literature being her only entertainment while in the closet. The blindfold coming off once she had agreed to join the group. It was a blur of horror for a teenager who had little troubles before this, and the LSD only made it worse. The FBI would ineptly bust down several locations housing civilians on bad leads. Many called in from states as far as South Carolina, stating they had just seen Patricia Hearst. Everyone getting caught in a storm of sensation.
Although there is no substantial reason to believe Patty Hearst has fled California and is headed in this direction, the FBI is getting a lot of calls from Dallas area residents who think they have seen Miss Hearst.
We got quite a number over the weekend. I don't keep a real number of them. We haven't had too many, I think, last night or today. But these people are sincere. We had people who thought they saw her on a couple of planes and coming in here, and of course you have to run them out.
Suppose someone does see Patty Hearst. What should he do?
Well, he should immediately notify the nearest office of the FBI. As far as I'm concerned, we ought to know about it immediately.
Which is an unfortunate coincidence when it comes to Patricia's father, Randolph Apperson Hearst. As to understand who he is to understand why his daughter was kidnapped. Hearst was the youngest son of the owner of the largest news chain and media company to exist, Hearst Communications. This company mainly grew due to the type of news that it would commonly engage in. The journalists would exaggerate and sensationalize their stories while also focusing on the human, emotional element to get an easier response from the viewer. The facts were much less interesting. His father, William Randolph Hearst, was the king of clickbait, one that we can thank for that shit still permeating today. The SLA knew that his son, Randolph Apperson Hearst, was a chairman for the media conglomerate. They saw the Hearst News outlet as a factory for fear-mongering articles and pushing false narratives on their readers. They also knew he had a lot of money, but how much? Forbes had estimated that his estate at the time of his death was around $1.8 billion. So yeah, stinking rich. And the SLA had hoped that the influence of money and of Randolph Hearst would be able to get the newly arrested Russ Little and Joe Ramiro out of jail and ransom for Patricia. This was deemed impossible. So they decided to put the Hearst fortune to another use, food distribution. The SLA's second message asked Hearst to use his millions to feed those unable to feed themselves.
The high hopes of the Hearst family to get their daughter Patty back from her kidnappers quickly were shattered by a tape received from the Symbionese Liberation Army. The tape was made by Symbionese Liberation Army Field Marshal Sin Q. Here are excerpts from that tape.
9. That the total amount of $6 million be allotted to your designated people in need or charity organization within 24 hours of receipt of this order, and that the food be available to the people within 1 week of receipt of this order. Should this order be rejected, all further communications shall be suspended. Should any attempt be made to rescue the subject prisoner or to injure or capture our captured soldiers, the subject is to be executed immediately. 10. Once we see compliance with these specifications and the program well underway, then, as we have previously stated, we will begin negotiations for the release of your daughter.
At the end of the tape, Patty herself simply dated it.
Today is the 19th, and yesterday the Shah of Iran had 2 people executed at dawn.
Hearst complied and set up PEN, or People in Need. The director of PEN figured they would be able to feed 100,000 people for 12 months for about $2 million. But that wasn't enough. A second communique arrives asking for Hearst contributions to reflect his capabilities. $6 million would be how much Hearst would need to give. That, and to stop the rampant misinformation, on top of contributing funds to companies intent on using the working class. 2 days after Patricia's 20th birthday, the first food distribution would happen in San Francisco. It was an unmitigated disaster. Riots broke out as people surged and panicked workers threw the boxes of food from moving trucks. Many people were injured and chaos ensued. The governor at the time, Ronald Reagan, had not predicted that all these people would show up and would later chastise them for aiding and abetting lawlessness. And in a real bout of class would go on to say, "Just too bad we can't have an epidemic of botulism." The worst president. Randolph Hearst was also not fondly looked upon for the establishment of this. He was seen as giving in to terrorists and shunned by officials on all levels, including the Red Cross. The next SLA message would come with demands in order to remedy the situation. They asked the food distribution program to be put in the hands of a small community-driven coalition called Western Addition Project Area Committee, or WAPAC. They would handle the next 6 distributions, handing out more than 100,000 bags of groceries to the poor and hungry, all of it without a hitch. And after the SLA had asked for the $6 million, Hearst tried to negotiate, saying he could do $2 million now and then 2 more at the beginning of the next year. This would not be enough for the SLA, and Hearst would eventually kill the operation. The community coalition members that helped in this drive would go on to use this knowledge to help create non-profit groups dedicated to improving food, housing, childcare, and transit. So at least some good came out of this. That good would not last long though. And it was on April 13th, 1974, that the Hearst family heard their worst nightmares. In another tape sent to a local radio station, Patricia denounces her family and authorities, saying that none of them are truly trying to help. She was given the option to be free or fight at their side, and she chose to fight, now a comrade in arms. Her new name being Tanya, a nom de guerre taken from Che Guevara's companion. The SLA's revolution was also now hers. And it wouldn't be but 2 days later when she would be caught proving that new faith to her captors. At 10 a.m., Patricia, DeFries, Ms. Moon, Perry, and Hall burst into the Hibernia Bank. DeFries yells that they're here for money and this is the Tanya Hearst. One of the bank managers flipped a switch on the cameras, helping catch the SLA in action. Members clearly brandishing carbines and screaming demands at the onlookers. The five made it out with $10,000, but it wasn't without a hitch. Something had gone wrong, and they had shot 2 of the bank customers. Luckily, these would prove to be non-fatal, and this would keep the SLA afloat a little bit longer, while accruing them even more heat. The FBI put out a wanted poster for their arrest, listing Patricia as a material witness at this point. The group had also lost all goodwill with any local communities thanks to the assassination of Marcus Foster. DeFries had friends in Los Angeles that he believed he could gain support from and moved the SLA out there. And it would be here about a month later when the killer revolutionaries would make a huge mistake. Patricia had been traveling with both of the Harrises when they decided to get supplies from a Mel's sporting goods store. Bill and Emily were inside when Bill got the bright idea to steal a bandolier. A security guard caught him in the act. Bill wasn't having it though and brought out his revolver. And as he was doing this, the security guard managed to wrangle the gun out of his hand and managed to get some cuffs on. Emily then came from behind, pushing the guard and then fleeing with Bill. Patricia, who was waiting in the nearby car, saw the uproar inside and shot several rounds at the store sign. Everyone recoiled in fear, except for the Harrises, who bounded out of the store into the nearby waiting van. The trio would abandon the van and take off in a new stolen vehicle. And in the rush, they left behind the revolver that Bill had tried to brandish. It was registered in Emily's name. They would also forget the address of the current SLA hideout in the abandoned van. The police would check the address but found that all the members had left after witnessing the event on television. The group was laying low in a nearby house after bribing the residents. And in true SLA fashion, they could not stop attracting attention. Besides being a group made up mainly of white women trying to lay low in a predominantly black neighborhood, they would also constantly be seen stockpiling new weapons, building the arsenal for their would-be army. The neighbors, understandably growing more fearful, would call the police. And it would be here where the true beginning of the end for the SLA would begin to happen, amid a storm of gunfire and rising flames.
A home that went up in unchecked flames is the climax of a shootout in which Los Angeles police fired more ammunition than they ever had fired before in a single law enforcement assault. Just who are the 5 persons killed? That still is not known. If any of them have been identified, it's not been officially disclosed. At Hillsborough, California, the Randolph-Hearst family has apparently given in to the inevitable fear.
Here's the way it started, John. Late this afternoon, Los Angeles news media were notified by police that police might have a raid somewhere in South Los Angeles and that a command post was being set up. We rushed to the area. The exact location of the target house was not known at that point, but shortly after 5 o'clock, massive numbers of police moved in and cordoned off an 8-square-block area, bordered by Long Beach Boulevard on the east and Hooper on the west from 57 Street south 4 blocks. I was standing about 100 yards away when police found their target, a yellow 1-story house on 54th near Compton. A live CBS camera crew was on the scene, and this is what it looked like.
Billy, let's see if we couldn't still get this picture, but from a little better location, huh?
Well, I don't know if it's a good idea to interview somebody right now.
That's a mighty thin palm tree right in front of us.
We just took a bullet a couple inches or so because we felt it go by. We felt it go by, that's right. And heard it. And that's as close as I want to be to one, let me tell you.
It was about then that a lone black woman came stumbling from the front of the house, her hands bound behind her, gasping from the tear gas. The woman shouted at the attacking police that she was giving up and that she had been held hostage. Officers rushed into the crossfire and pulled her bodily out of the danger area. Under intense questioning, she told police that there were 4 more heavily armed people inside, and all the while the battle continued. A short time later, no one really knew why, fire was spotted coming from the house.
It appears to have spread to the adjacent house.
It does.
It is just unbelievable that there could be anybody in there shooting back. We were told earlier in the afternoon that there was a basement in that house, and perhaps the people who were being sought were in that basement. If so, that would give them a few more minutes to stay alive and fire back at the police.
Oh, boy.
Not much more than that. Look at the huge ball of smoke and flame going up out of here now.
Right, Bob.
Several companies of the Los Angeles Fire Department were poised at both the north and south ends of the battle zone, but police would not allow them near the blaze because, in spite of the inferno, firing from the house continued, much of it organized, some of it the explosions caused by round upon round of ammunition igniting in that intense heat. Huge clouds of dense black smoke blew eastward from the house and could be seen for miles. The flames destroyed the target house and heavily damaged 2 others. It was a full hour later, after the firefight began, that firemen were finally allowed in the area. Luckily, they were able to extinguish the flames quickly before the blaze spread further. But suddenly, in the space of slightly more than an hour, what had been a relatively quiet neighborhood had become a battleground, and then a scene of total desolation. The experience of watching the Holocaust in progress was more shocking, more terrifying than anything I have ever experienced. I crouched on the floor of a cornered grocery store about 100 yards from the bombardment for more than half an hour, with about 15 men, women, and children, all part confused, part excited, and all of them scared enough not to want to leave that floor. And when it was over, everyone seemed to know what had just happened to them, but it'll be a while before any of us really knows what it all really meant.
On the afternoon of May 17, 1974, over 9,000 rounds of ammunition were fired between the 6 members of the SLA and the surrounding 374-person task force made up of LAPD, SWAT, FBI, and Highway Patrol. It began with the leader of the SWAT team announcing over bullhorn, "Occupants of 1466 East 54th Street, this is the Los Angeles Police Department speaking. Come out with your hands up." No answer. The police then proceeded to do this 18 more times. And this is when the LAPD fired gas canisters, choking the house. The SLA let go a hail of bullets from their modified carbines in retaliation. The storm of lead and smoke airing on the news to terrified onlookers. Some of those being the Harrises and Hearst, who fled from their hotel in Anaheim. One of the largest police shootouts in U.S. history continued to rage. Police requested use of hand grenades, but were denied, and continued to siege with tear gas. The officers were beginning to run low on ammunition when the house caught fire. The 2 original house residents fled through the back door and a neighbor through the front. They were taken in unarmed by the awaiting police. Camille Hall and Nancy Ling Perry also ran through the front. Police stated that Hall aimed her gun and fired on the surrounding officers, while Perry provided covering fire. The task force fatally shot Hall once in the head and Perry twice in the back. Angela Atwood pulled Hall's body inside and retreated back into the house, not able to reach Perry's. She, Donald Freeze, Miss Moon, and Willie Wolf would hide under a crawl space under the house for safety. This proved Pyrrhic at best. DeFreeze would shoot himself in the temple, while the others would succumb to smoke inhalation from the ever-filling crawl space. The only casualties in the vicious shootout. Soon, the roof of the building would be weakened by fire and collapse in a spray of rubble. Police would recover 19 firearms from the ruins. After fleeing the motel, the Harrises and Hearst crashed in multiple flop houses with $50 to their name. And during this time, Emily Harris went to a rally at Berkeley to honor the SLA members who died in the shootout. Emily finds an old friend there, Kathleen Celaya. Celaya introduced them to sports journalist Jack Scott, who offered the 3 a hideout in his Pennsylvania farm in return for their statements for a book he'd write on the SLA. This wasn't in the plans for them though, and they moved to Sacramento reneging on any deals. And William Harris would take control of the group as the new General Field Marshal. He he announced that the group would now be known as the New World Liberation Front. Numerous bombings would be done by fledgling members at corporate offices and utility sites under this newly christened banner. Hearst and the Harrises would also be introduced to Scott's girlfriend, Wendy Yoshimura, who was involved with several of her own bombings while in another radical group known as the Revolutionary Army. This bias towards bombs would lead Celaya to place 2 under LAPD cruisers, failing to detonate. The NWLF would leave their Sacramento hideout to stay with Yoshimura in her San Francisco home. During this time, both the $500,000 reward for Patty's return and the final $2 million ransom passes without any news on Patty. Running low on funds themselves, the group decided to rob another bank, Crocker National Bank in Carmichael. During the robbery, something went terribly wrong. The faulty shotgun that Emily Harris was wielding discharged and killed Myrna Opsel, a 42-year-old nurse and mother of 2, who was there to deposit church collection money. A tragedy made even worse when Celaya kicked a pregnant teller in the stomach, causing a miscarriage. And it wouldn't be until 5 months later that this radical group's tirade would end. On September 18th, the FBI finally acted after they received a tip from Jack Scott's brother arresting Yoshimura and Hearst. Hearst would claim that she was feeling free and strong, all the time smiling, on her arrest forms listing her occupation as urban guerrilla. After a few days, Celaya and the Harrises would soon follow Hearst, and the trials would begin.
It was the day that Patricia Hearst had said she has had nightmares about for the past 2.5 years. But as she entered the federal courthouse this morning, the pale, thin newspaper heiress revealed little apprehension. Once in court, her defense team made an 11th-hour appeal for leniency. Attorney Al Johnson told Judge William Ork that Patricia had become a friend who he would cherish the rest of his life, that she had been terrorized, brutalized, pummeled, and beaten. Your Honor, he said, she's had enough. Prosecutor James Browning disagreed. The defendant continues to refuse to acknowledge her guilt, he said. She participated in the bank robbery with full knowledge that deadly weapons were to be used. We believe additional time in custody is warranted. After an hour-long recess, Judge Orrick reconvened the session, ordered the doors locked, and asked the defendant to stand and face the bench. Orrick told Miss Hearst and her attorneys that he had considered the bizarre circumstances surrounding the case, but that kidnapping was not relevant to the charges. He admonished the 22-year-old, saying violence is unacceptable in society and will not be tolerated. Miss Hearst, the nature of your conduct cannot be condoned. You are committed to 7 years. Patricia Hearst revealed little reaction.
She left the courtroom immediately. We haven't talked to her. I can simply predict that she was neither startled nor stunned because she has consistently expected the worst.
The sentence of the court imposed today in the Hearst case, in my opinion, is entirely appropriate and proper.
The Hearst family returned to their Nob Hill apartment immediately after the sentencing. Mrs. Hearst repeated what she had said before, that Patricia never had a break, not from the press, not from the court. Although sentenced to 7 years, Patricia Hearst will not have to serve the entire term. She has already spent 1 year in jail, for which she will be given credit, and she becomes eligible for parole in 16 months.
It was noted by the press that Hearst seemed a shadow of her former self from when she was arrested 3 months prior. Her bright, brassy hair, now a dulled chestnut, her tight, hip clothing now replaced with moderate garb, no longer throwing salutes for Black Power, instead staying motionless with eyes downcast to the floor, as if she were sharing a secret with herself. During this time, William Hearst had hired F. Lee Bailey for his daughter's defense. Later, becoming a member of O.J. Simpson's Dream Team, Hearst was not mucking about. He would argue that Patricia Hearst was brainwashed similar to the POWs in the Korean War. He argued that she was never under her own volition but only acting to stay alive under duress. The combination of isolation, LSD, physical and mental abuse, and being force-fed rhetoric, which led to her turn as a freedom fighter in the SLA's army. Which was interesting because brainwashing at this time had still not been accepted as a defense. It still hasn't. But this was a defense that the Hearst parents wanted, the defense that their swaths of cash was paying for. They would never believe that their precious daughter would voluntarily join the SLA. Also, brainwashing might look good when a fading defense attorney uses his book rights to tell the Patricia Hearst story. Another Vincent Bugliosi in the making. The prosecution would make use of any of the recorded tapes and footage of the SLA to paint a different picture, many in which Patricia would refute claims of brainwashing and extol the virtues of the SLA.
In an extremely bitter statement, Patty Hearst once again says she has joined the SLA and has not been brainwashed.
The enemy still wants me dead. I am obviously alive and well. As for being brainwashed, the idea is ridiculous to the point of being beyond belief. As for my ex-fiancé, I'm amazed that he thinks that the first thing that I would want to do once freed would be to rush and see him.
Thank you very much.
The fact is, I don't care if I ever see him again.
Say something about maybe this afternoon.
During the last few months, Stephen has shown himself to be a sexist, ageist pig. I hope that the last action has put his mind at ease. If it didn't, further actions will. I was positioned so that I could hold customers and bank personnel who were on the floor. My gun was loaded, and at no time did any of my comrades intentionally point their guns at me.
Randolph Hearst and his wife issued a written statement saying that they remain convinced that Patricia has been brainwashed under extreme duress. They say they are not surprised by the newest tape, and we're just glad Patty is still alive.
She said she had loved the SLA, but most of all, Willie Wolf, a necklace bearing the stone monkey face of Olmec resting inside Patricia's purse at the time of arrest, given to her by Wolf. When asked to explain why she had it, Patricia weakly answered that she liked art. The prosecution questioned the innocent facade. Why would she have books like explosives and homemade bombs on the shelf of her old apartment? And why not escape when given ample opportunity? The opening statements encapsulating this battle perfectly. The prosecution would quote Patricia on one of the SLA tapes. "My gun was loaded, and at no time did any of my comrades intentionally point their guns at me." The defense argued that the robbery had been staged with Patricia being put at the forefront as their prized mascot. They argued it was the first time in the history of a bank robbery that a robber was asked to identify themselves in the middle of the act. And it was noted that when presented with this footage, Patricia only stared in disbelief before sobbing uncontrollably. And the jury seemed to be on the side of the defense until the psychiatrists were brought in to bring in expert testimony. The most influential of this being Joel Fort, a psychiatrist who started his own clinic, Fort Help, to treat those suffering from drug abuse and thoughts of self-harm. It's still in operation as a methadone clinic today, and just want to note that he seemed to do a lot of good in order to help overlooked communities, trying to provide support for those locked in drug addiction and those ostracized for being homosexual or not holding to traditional gender norms. Modern thought in an era when it was trying to be regressed. Told the jury to be wary of the defense psychiatrists who have an invested interest to help Patricia avoid jail time. She would not be treated as every patient would under scientific scruples. He also questioned how they could draw perfect conclusions about someone's mental state 15 months prior. He argued that Patricia was already of the demeanor prone towards radical behavior. She had already lied about her mom getting cancer to get out of an exam and was already engaging in drugs and promiscuity. He argued that this directionless state of existing without purpose helps lead lost souls to identify the first random ideology that finds them. This would make something like the SLA even more appealing, a way to act against the upper-class upbringing that even her other brainwashed members were acting against.
Randolph and Catherine Hearst left the federal prison in San Francisco in a much different mood than earlier in the week. Since Patty's capture a week ago, they'd been happy and smiling, glad to know she was in good health. And court depositions had indicated that Patty was brainwashed by the SLA and might now be the same Patty Hearst who was kidnapped early in 1974. But a federal judge released excerpts of a taped conversation Miss Hearst had with a girlhood friend. Patty told her friend at the San Mateo jail's visiting room last Saturday that she wanted no part of a bail arrangement which would make her, in her words, a prisoner in my parents' home. Taping conversations between prisoners and visitors is standard procedure, and that tape was produced by the U.S. Attorney's Office for use by psychiatrists in determining her ability to stand trial. Also in that conversation, Patty told her friend that she'd let her parents know, again a quote, that my politics were different.
And at every opportunity, it seemed that the prosecution was able to undercut any defense that Patricia was able to muster. And after 12 hours of deliberation, the jury found Patricia guilty of armed robbery on March 20th, 1976. One juror said that the defense made him completely accept or reject the brainwashing theory and concluded that her firing at the sign in front of Mel's that day didn't line up with that narrative of being a weak-willed passenger. Holding Wolf's token of affection bothered another, some taking her disassociated state as incrimination, but many finding her 42 uses of the Fifth Amendment extremely damning. One juror explained why he couldn't understand why a witness would only recall what they wanted to. Patricia Hearst would be sentenced to 7 years in prison. Wendy Yoshimura would be let off as the police did not have a warrant to enter her home, but she would be convicted on explosive charges from her time in the Revolutionary Army. The Harrises would be sentenced to 8 years for their involvement in the kidnapping. 2 years prior, Russ Little and Joseph Romero would get life for the murder of Marcus Foster. Little would win an appeal and later be acquitted in 1981. He would state that it was DeFreeze, Ms. Moon, and Nancy Ling Perry that led the attack on the school superintendent. Miss Moon was the one who fired the killing shot on Blackburn, while Perry botched Blackburn's shooting, causing DeFreeze to let loose with his shotgun. Kathleen Celaya went into hiding under a false identity until 1999. Her neighbor had been watching America's Most Wanted and recognized the woman that had been a few houses down. She would be sentenced to a total of 14 years in prison for the attempted bombings. Celaya claims that she was innocent but pleaded guilty in order to lessen her sentence. Yep, sure. Thing I had not mentioned before with Myrna Opsahl was that it was actually an unsolved cold case up until 2002 when new evidence was found to prosecute Kathleen Celaya, the Harrises, and Michael Borton and James Kilgore. Kilgore had to be extradited from South Africa. They all pled guilty to second-degree murder and would receive no more than 8 years for their involvement, except for Kilgore, who was let off but still received time on explosive charges. None staying in jail beyond 2009 except for Joseph Romero, the only remaining member still in jail.
4 former Symbionese Liberation Army members accused of murdering a Carmichael woman during a bank robbery in 1975 plead guilty today.
In court, 4 of the SLA members who pulled off the heist apologized 27 years after Myrna Opsahl was killed during a bank robbery in Carmichael.
Each of these defendants entered a plea of guilty to murder in the second degree. In addition, Mr. Harris admitted that he was armed during the commission of the crime. This is the time and the place for judgment of the sentence. When we finish today, the defendants will be remanded into custody to serve sentences in state prison.
As I stated last time, the fact that Mrs. Opsahl was murdered and unintentionally in the bank is of no consequence to the family, and the fact that we beat ourselves up more than anyone could and really alienated ourselves from what we believed in and ostracized ourselves. And that's probably the saddest thing about these kind of cases, whether you're well-intentioned or poor-intentioned or not, is there's not a good result. A woman is dead and many people suffer from those consequences. And I can offer nothing but my apologies, and I'm sorry.
Ms. Montague will be sentenced to 8 years in prison. Mr. Harris will be sentenced to 7 years in prison. Ms. Olson will be sentenced to 6 years in prison. Mr. Borton will be sentenced to 6 years in prison.
During her time in jail, a well-known psychiatrist wrote a letter to Jimmy Carter asking for Patricia Hearst's pardon. He wouldn't get exactly that, but the president did reduce her sentence to 22 months. President Bill Clinton would fully pardon her on his way out in 2001. But once you find out who the psychiatrist was that wrote the letter to Carter, same psychiatrist who had worked pro bono for the defense, arguing in favor of brainwash, a whole new can of worms gets opened. Why would he be allowed to have the initial meetings with Patty Hearst in secret? And this is where we get into conspiratorial territory. So just know that everything here is alleged, but there's a lot of circumstantial evidence found in leaked documents, and those gained from the Freedom of Information Act. And everything else is in my opinion alone. So time to take any credibility and just throw it out the window. On to conspiracy land. So that psychiatrist I mentioned, he's the same one that I spoke of in the Jimmy Shaver video. And watch that if you want even more on him. But with no further ado, the king of LSD and secret ops himself, Louis Jolyon West, or Jolly. A Brooklynite who eventually became a colonel in the Air Force after joining in World War II. It would be the government that would help fund his mad scientist experiments in his favorite field of study, manipulating human behavior. Allegations of his behavior landed the front page of the New York Times in 1977. Tom O'Neill, in his research for Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of 60s, pretty much confirms it with his links of evidence. He would experiment on military recruits, prison inmates, and the dregs of society, usually with some mixture of LSD, barbiturates, and hypnosis. Similar methods to those countries he saw looking to brainwash the US populace. His first real interaction happening when deprogramming American POWs that had spoken out against the US on TV, alleging unlawful use of biological warfare. He would later go on to make paper headlines again when a zoo elephant named Tusko was given LSD by Mr. West and soon died afterward. It was reported that it had an LSD overdose that has been contested with a far more likely scenario in which West introduced another drug in order to help counteract the LSD, and the elephant died from the horribly portioned chemical cocktail. This was a favorite story of his to tell at parties. A swell guy. He would also have two other headline-popping cases for similar happening events. One involved Jimmy Shaver, a member of the Air Force that was found wandering in a daze after the grisly discovery of a dead child nearby. West was able to get a confession, though Jimmy stated that he couldn't remember what happened, getting the same results from Jack Ruby, the killer of JFK's assassin. West would be left alone with these men and would have a confession within a few hours. But it was his letter to Sherman Grifford, a pseudonym for the head of CIA's Sidney Gottlieb, that chillingly confirms his ties to MKUltra, something he denied for the 149 projects being tested by the CIA in order to learn how to control human behavior on unwitting participants. Looking to beat Russia and China at making a Manchurian candidate and eradicate any dissidence towards the US by its people. The records released painting a horrible picture with lines like, "Can we obtain control of future activities of any individual willing or unwilling with a guarantee of amnesia?" Or, "Can we force an individual to act against his own moral concepts?" And the most chilling, "Can an individual be made to perform an act of assassination?" In a letter to Gottlieb, West pretty much confirms that their experimentation was a success. But to what degree, we'll never know. When I see a guy like this involved, it definitely raises some eyebrows. He worked as a brainwashing expert during the Patricia Hearst trial without fee, arguing in favor of her showing signs of coercion and brainwashing. And even though he couldn't win over the jury or judge, President Jimmy Carter's pardon would come after West addressed an article to the president. The mixture of isolation, food and sleep deprivation, and psychedelic drugs influencing the radical behavior. So if this movie villain believed that Hearst had been coerced into fighting for the SLA under the influence of LSD and other psychological abuse, could any of the other members been influenced without their knowing? And could a program be set up in order to incite radicals, just to smear their name and any leftist ideas threatening the American way? Nah, it was two. Project Chaos and Project COINTELPRO were put into operation in August 1967 by both the CIA and FBI. J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, started COINTELPRO to increase factionalism among communists in the US, most often used to vilify civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., its name actually standing for the not-so-subtle Counterintelligence Program. Hoover wrote a memo in 1967 outlining this new branch. Its aim: to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize the activities of black nationalist hate-type organizations. The activities of all such groups of intelligence interests to this bureau must be followed on a continuous basis. Efforts of various groups to consolidate their forces or to recruit new or youthful adherents must be frustrated. No opportunity must be missed to exploit the organizational and personal conflicts of the leadership of the groups, and to capitalize upon existing conflicts between competing black nationalist organizations. Yes, a lot. all these being tactics used in countless other countries in the 1940s like the Philippines and South Korea. Now these tactics would be used on homegrown soil. The most essential part of this operation being the undercover agents sent to infiltrate the groups. They would do everything they can to gain information and then exert their influence over the group. The government going as far as to commute sentences of prisoners if it meant they would join the cause. These people would be trained in a military base in Quantico, Virginia to mimic the groups they were infiltrating. With a menagerie of men wandering around with long hair and unkempt beards high on their minds on LSD. A small bit of sketch comedy and an overall horror show. And the main focus seemed to be on the Black Panther Party. Originally a group set up in Oakland to help safeguard the people from volatile police. They even had programs to provide food and healthcare for those in need. And between multiple shootouts with police, murders, and paranoia tearing them apart, the party would eventually fall. And the paranoia, even though misdirected, did not seem completely unfounded, because in January 1967, the FBI would show the links that they would go to. Undercover FBI lied to the Black Panthers' rivals, the US organization, and said the BPP was planning a meeting on campus to assassinate them. So the US organization ambushed 2 BPP members at a student union meeting in UCLA. They would be shot and killed, with neither group none the wiser. They would use much less subtle tactics later that year in December, when FBI informant and right-hand man in the BPP, William O'Neill, slipped barbiturates into Fred Hampton's drink during dinner. Hampton was the leader of the BPP at the time, and the next thing you know, 2 bullets found their way into the head of Hampton at point-blank range, the rounds belonging to the local police. The only reason we know of both of these events was thanks to the Citizens Committee to investigate, a group of civilians who took it upon themselves to go undercover and steal documents from an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania. Hoover tried to track them down but would not be able to. They revealed themselves in 2014. The documents also showing the complicity of the Los Angeles Sheriff's Office, getting the most desirable outcome from the UCLA ambush. In a 1970 memo from their field office, it said, "The Los Angeles Division is aware of mutually hostile feeling harbored between the organizations, and the first opportunity to capitalize on the situations will be maximized. It is intended that the U.S. organization will be appropriately and discreetly advised of the time and location of the BPP activities, in order that the 2 organizations might be brought together, and thus grant nature the opportunity to take her course." The levels of callousness towards a horrific murder is staggering. Well, now that we know what the FBI was up to, let's check in on the CIA and their new program, Operation Chaos, an illegal surveillance program that directed agents and informants to neutralize what was viewed as dissident groups. The president at the time, Lyndon B. Johnson, could not fathom that the disordered state of the country could be on his hands. Foreign entities must be interfering. So it was up to the CIA to sniff out those foreign infiltrators. The program kept tabs on over 300,000 people, with 7,000 being Americans. Agents infiltrating anti-war groups, just like their FBI counterparts. A journalist, Seymour Hersh, broke open the story, and the head of the CIA, William Colby, had to admit that the findings were accurate. Unfortunately, the band of people that were brought together to investigate both Chaos and COINTELPRO, the Church Committee, were woefully inadequate in their investigations, with many documents being destroyed under their nose and eventually little reprisal of the insanely illegal activities being put into practice. So I think you can start to see where this picture that I'm slowly painting is starting to go. The SLA, being an anti-war group that learned to defend themselves with firearms, who preached anti-government and pro-black rhetoric, seemed like the prime candidate to be infiltrated, especially within UCLA, where many of these people, including those in government, seem to be tied to. There was even an SLA tape that came out condemning the Black Panther Party. So if there was a possibility that one of the members could be working for the government, pushing these dissidents ever towards violence, who was it? But before we can answer that, I have yet another rabbit hole for us to go down. Willie Wolf's father and another one of the families hired Lake Headley, a private investigator, to look into the SLA matter. Headley had been a Las Vegas police officer before he had left to become a PI after killing a suspect in the line of duty. He became a freelance investigator in many high-profile cases. A freelance writer, Donald Freed, helped him collect his findings into 400 pages of documentation. He would go on to file a sworn affidavit and give a press conference 13 days before the LA shootout. He concluded that Patricia Campbell Hearst and her parents disagreed bitterly over Patricia's political and personal relations, that a love affair between a black man and Patricia Hearst did take place prior to her relationship with her fiancé, Stephen Weed, that Mrs. Randolph A. Hearst subjected her daughter to extreme pressure to change her personal and political relationships. And I believe you can guess who that black man was. And another investigator on this case, Rusty Rhodes, and yes, that is his actual name, has sworn affidavits from prisoners close to DeFreeze stating that Hearst had carried on a relationship with DeFreeze during prison visits under minimal security. Hearst would use the alias and idea of Mary Alice Sims, Darrow Wheeler's girlfriend, which you can see as being pretty probable with how similar they look, but they would always be under the eye of the UCLA teacher and head of the prison outreach program, Colston Westbrook, his outreach being wider than it seemed. Westbrook had been a contractor in Vietnam for Pacific Architects and Engineer Incorporated, a subsidiary of Pacific Architects, a company front for the CIA. Free noted that Westbrook's specialty was agent handling, training, and indoctrination, which I can tell you is not too far off from the program that Pacific Architects was involved with during Vietnam. The CIA had put Operation Phoenix into force, a project to destabilize the political infrastructure of the Viet Cong. U.S. forces would kill Viet Cong families and then stage it to look like the Viet Cong were responsible for killing their own. The CIA believed that the Viet Cong would then no longer trust their own and come running towards the good guys, the United States of America. It would sound insane saying it out loud, but that would not be the only link that Westbrook would have. Helly would also find connections with the Criminal Conspiracy Section of the Los Angeles Police Department and the State of California Criminal Identification and Investigation Unit. So the guy that happened to get these young, impressionable college students to link with these black radicals was involved in programs to neutralize dissidents and defectors of the American way. Not weird in the slightest. No weirder than when you find out that it would not be the only link to DeFreeze, Operation Phoenix, and the Los Angeles Police Department. Headley had made many connections to DeFreeze and William W. Herman, a lieutenant for the LAPD that had an interesting background. He had a doctorate in psychology, specialized in quelling insurgencies, and even developed a computer system to track and predict violent outbreaks from criminals. He had also done classified jobs for American intelligence agencies, the Air Force, the Secret Service, the Treasury Department, the President's Office of Science and Technology, the Institute for Defense Analysis, the Defense Industrial Security Clearance Office, the Defense Department's Advanced Research Projects Agency. This suited-up bear had his hand in a lot of honeypots. He would also leave for South Vietnam in 1968 to help as a scientific advisor for the military. And even though it hasn't been officially recorded what he did there, and it seems obvious with his training and record of work that he would be involved with Operation Phoenix. So when the second-in-command for the District Attorney's Office of Los Angeles, Lynn Compton, wrote a letter to Airman in 1968 thanking him for obtaining good advance intelligence on subversives and militants, feels weirdly similar to the goals laid out by Chaos and COINTELPRO. But we have to look no further than the District Attorney for LA, Avell Younger, to see why government influence would not be out of the question. Younger was one of the top agents in Hoover's FBI, doing a myriad of intelligence work. He would leave to join the Office of Strategic Service. Being a friend of Reagan, he was appointed the head of a force tasked with keeping law and order and cracking down on threats to the nation's security. The man appointing him? Richard Nixon, old Tricky Dick himself. And it was stated in the book, Big Brother and the Holding Company, The World Behind Watergate, that Younger had advised Nixon to use more wiretaps and encourage space-age techniques and hardware in order to support local law enforcement. But why am I telling you all this about Airman and Younger? What would DeFreeze have to do with these two prolific government spooks? And according to Headley, DeFreeze was an informant for the LAPD and intelligence agencies. And this actually goes a long way to paint a picture of a criminal who was constantly being arrested and being let out as he was willing to turn on any partner that he had in crime. And it was noted that something very similar was happening with Charles Manson at the time, being picked up for grand theft or violent charges and constantly being let go with barely a slap on the wrist. Some also painting Manson as an informant, operating in a similar location at an earlier time surrounded by the same shadowy government agents. And I tried to look up information on the San Francisco's DA at the time, but wasn't able to get much information. But I did find an obituary, and in the obituary it mentions him being part of counterintelligence work. So, yeah, another one. So an article ran in the New York Times talking about DeFreeze's links as an informant, but it fell into obscurity as the fire and shootout that happened in LA was on the same day that the article ran, being swept under the rug like many of the records and details surrounding these intelligence agencies in the 60s and 70s. And originally when I had written this, I found this to be a pretty simple case. You actually find the first video probably a lot different from this one, and a lot shorter too, because I was not expecting what I would be coming into. There were a few articles painting a conspiracy theory, but I felt those were pretty crackpot at the time. And that was until I was given this book to read, Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s. Seeing the reach of the government at this time and their secretive all-out assault on anyone they deemed a threat, things seem a lot more plausible. And while these are only glimpses of pieces of a larger, much darker puzzle, one could see how the SLA is included. And this is wholly in my opinion, but it feels as if DeFreeze was watched and exploited by the government in hopes of either eradicating radicals keen on his cause, or leaving the SLA around long enough to turn them against the Black Panther Party. Had they been truly infiltrated by one of the agents, sowing dissidence until it erupted in a way that could not have been predicted? And why didn't the FBI catch the SLA sooner? They had to have known where the group was, using bases connected with the Weather Underground and other radical organizations that the FBI already knew about and had tabs on. So yeah, they should have definitely known about that. So why did they wait then? Could it have just been an experiment that went awry? And in the last weird set of connections in the story, I found that sociologists believe that the name for Symbionese Liberation Army came from a fictional novel called The Spook Who Sat by the Door. It is about the first black CIA agent, Dan Freeman, who is hired so the intelligence group doesn't look racist. He is used as a puppet for their propaganda until he is tired of being made a minstrel. He then uses his training in guerrilla warfare and subversion to begin recruiting freedom fighters from local gangs under the head of his gang, the Cobras. And if you give the Cobra 7 heads, it begins to look a lot more like the SLA symbol. The Cobras would rob banks, broadcast propaganda over radio stations, and would kidnap and drug the commander of the National Guard with LSD. I don't think we can hit any more checks with this one. And this was also weirdly relevant with Charles Manson, who was also handed a sci-fi novel by his parole officer, Robert Smith. This book would be Stranger in a Strange Land by Robert Heinlein. It's about a human raised on Mars who has hypnotic powers. He comes to Earth to have sex with women to propagate the race while showing them how to surrender their egos and find spiritual fulfillment through total submission. They would sleep and eat together while engaging in a ritual of passing water, sounding very similar to sharing LSD. Some believe this book became a blueprint for Manson. He loved it enough to name his first child after the main character, and call Robert Smith the name of the mentor to the main character. Fictional novels being taken criminally serious. So would these books find their way into the hands of those that they resonated with? Those more prone to fall into its pages, seeing themselves as the main character. Just another way to control behavior, pushing others with a subtle guiding hand. So, all in all, I don't know. I do think there were a lot of innocent, impressionable people that were possibly caught into something beyond their means that may have been pushed further into worse actions by forces beyond them. And I know there can also be a lot of discourse over brainwashing and ideas of it and whether people truly consider people can be brainwashed. But I can definitely say, at least from all the research I've done involving cults, that the key combinations of isolation, of food deprivation, of sleep deprivation, and also using drugs in order to loosen the ego structure, these 4 things commonly worked in order to break people down. There you have it, folks, the whole shebang. So do you think that these were impressionable youths pushed into disorder by subtle forces? Or maybe it was all coincidence, with like-minded individuals collecting under a banner of similar thought in order to perform horrific actions in the name of the greater good. And even though I don't consider DeFreeze the Che Guevara that he sees himself as, was he as altruistic in his fight for equality as his messages purported? And was Patty just a helpless victim or a co-conspirator in her kidnapping? All these new information and patterns forming even more question marks. So now that I think I'm pretty much completely insane, let me know what you think in the comments. And I appreciate you all bearing with me on this ride, because it's just me working on it, and as you can tell, it was very extensive. But yeah, I'll definitely be peeling back, probably doing some shorter videos, and I really didn't want to leave you with just a part 1, so I did really want to finish the part 2, but I also want to make sure everything was right and have all this other information, because I haven't heard too many people talk about these things involved. But hey, if you enjoy something a little bit more long form like this, I can always see what I can do in the future. Anyways, thank you for delving into the shadows with me today.